He publishes a widely read monthly investment newsletter, the Gloom, Boom, and Doom report, which highlights unusual investment opportunities. I'm not going to go through it all, but he's a bestseller in Japanese, Chinese, Thai, German, English, you name it. He's a regular speaker at various investment seminars, gloomboomdoom.com. But he also got in big SJW trouble lately. We've seen the leftist professors everywhere saying, kill all the white people. And white people are inherently evil. And they're mainly white folks saying this. And we know in the WikiLeaks they say, we want culture war. We want everybody fighting with each other while we rob them. But then Faber simply said, well, thank God the U.S. got populated by Europeans because they brought in the Renaissance and technology, or we wouldn't have our modern civilization. So we should have some love for the Renaissance, some love for the West. I know I like other inventions and things, we get from China or, wherever. And I certainly like coffee and things like that from the Americas. I mean, it all makes us richer, our cultures. But it's really in now to demonize white people. And so Marc Faber, not known as an evil white supremacist, has gotten a lot of trouble. I've been labeled by the mainstream media as a racist. Dr. Boom, Marc Faber fires back. So I wanted to get him on about the economy, get him on about Trump, get him on about all this, and let him to actually respond versus what MSM has been twisting. Mark, good to have you on with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Where should we start?
Wherever you want to start, we can start with the history of civilizations, or we can start with racism because it comes in many different forms. And most people actually don't really know what racism is.
Well, let's start with a brief history of the world and then get into race, and then let's get into where you see the economy currently. And the left's now eating itself. The Democratic Party's imploding. The EU globalists are imploding. I mean, I think they better understand people are rejecting all this race baiting.
Well, the thing is this. If you look back at, let's say, recorded history, we go back 5,000 years to roughly 3000 BC, then we had civilizations rising and then civilizations declining, usually through internal strife or decadence and so forth. We had cities becoming important and then cities contracting. I wrote a book once a long time ago, The Rise and the Fall of Great Cities. And I mean, it's very interesting when you look at, say, year 3000 BC, the Egyptians, they built Karnak, Luxor, and they built the pyramids. At that time, the Europeans were still living in caverns, stilts on lakes. And so we had an incredibly advanced civilization in Egypt in the year 3000 BC. And then we had the Assyrian Empire and the Persian Empire. And then we had the Greeks, Alexander the Greek, who, by the way, was very good at destroying cities and took most of the population right away into slavery. Which was the pattern for the last few thousand years. Essentially, the men were killed and the women were taken into slavery, or both. And so we have this continuous change. We had the Romans. The Romans were incredibly advanced. And before the Romans, in another part of the world, which was not very well known, it was China. The Chinese were incredibly advanced. And so we have this pattern. Now we come to the discovery voyages. The discovery voyages were actually a very risky enterprise. Vasco da Gama, 1497, discovery of the Cape of Good Hope. Magellan circumvented the world. Columbus, he went to the US. These were not just adventurers. These were people who took a huge risk because they took voyages into the unknown. And so we have essentially the Europeans arriving in the US. And we had also the age of colonialism and imperialism in other parts of the world. And of course, the white man was cruel. There's no question about this. But other people were equally cruel or even more cruel than the white man. And at least over the last 100 years or so, we become somewhat more human, although I'm not sure about that. But the others, sometimes they haven't become more human. And if we look at the history of World War I and World War II, we know very well that other people were extremely cruel as well. Not just the white
Exactly.
man.
So all you did was point out what is admitted, known history. They're now saying mathematics is racist. Costume parties are racist. It looks like the social engineers are staking out all of reality and claiming that everything must go through them like a cult.
Yes, it's a very unfortunate event because I think that when I look at the world development over the last 30, 40 years, we have essentially globalization starting in the 80s, and we have the breakdown of the socialist communist ideology, starting with the opening of China in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. Then we have the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and Russia turning essentially into a more capitalistic-oriented economy. And when the European expansion really started with the so-called Industrial Revolution, which had probably begun already around 1750, but I want to say this, the European Industrial Revolution was, of course, possible because the Europeans, and that every historian will point out, they invented something that the others never had, and that is capitalism. The capitalism is not conquering another country and just ripping them off, but it's working for a continuous and recurring profit. And you needed double accounting. No other country in the world had double accounting standards the Europeans had. And then, because of the age of Renaissance and the age of Enlightenment, we had all these inventors and all these scientists who suddenly said, the world is not flat.
So the West invented the middle class and capitalism, which is now the model of the world. So why are the ultra elites and the ruling classes waging war against the fount of success? It's because they don't want competition. They want this new austerity. They want their new world order. If you agree with me, say yes, please, sir. And then I want to expand into, is globalism in its authoritarian model now falling apart?
Yes. The thing, the ruling European political class, as well as the US, they may not know, but the point is simply, you know, in 1970, China consumed 2% of global industrial commodities. By 1990, it was 5%. In year 2000, it was 12%. Now it's over 50%. This is the major change. It's not that the West has absolutely collapsed, but relative to the rest of the world, they have been contracting massively.
That's right. Let's talk about why that's happening and where it's going with Marc Faber, ladies and gentlemen. He's written books on the bad parts, the good parts. He's written books on other civilizations. He's widely read around the world and admired by many other cultures. I know that as a fact. And so he's so demonized. Why does he think that happened? And then let's segue into why the West is contracting, why it's self-loathing, and what he thinks of the Trump phenomenon and where the economy is going. And can the nationalism we see coming up in Europe, coming up in other areas as a new revolution against artificial globalism, can it succeed? Marc Faber.
Yes, I mean, this is a very tough question, but I'd like to say that the welfare of the people has always been the alibi of the tyrant. And, you know, they tell you, well, everybody has to be the same and get some money, and we have basic income eventually and this and that. But basically, it's about power and it's about money, We know that the political establishment has made a lot of money. A lot of money has disappeared from the Defense Department, from the State Department, and the same goes in Europe. The Americans, they go and tell the world about corruption. Yeah, we have corruption in Asia, but I can tell you, I think the big corruption is actually where the governments are very big. And the biggest governments as a percent of the economy are in Europe. The more government you have, the less freedom you have. Milton Friedman, he explained this very well in his book, Capitalism and Freedom. The larger the government, the extreme is, of course, the communist, socialist planning economy, where the government controls everything. And then I suggest you read Animal Farm by George Orwell. You know what it is all about.
Absolutely. I notice you've got a bust of Mao Zedong behind you. I don't think you're a fan, though.
I'm not a fan of him. I'm not a fan of any politician, except maybe you could argue that Adenauer, after the Second World War, he was a great leader. He healed the German nation. But Mao is, of course, a villain like Stalin
Yes.
and like Hitler and like Napoleon, but some are perceived in a better light than others. But they're all kind of evil people. But one thing about Mao, and this is also interesting about Stalin, Stalin is the most popular leader of Russia ever, including all the czars, because he defeated the Germans. And the Mao, I have to give him credit. You see, what happened is China, and by the way, also India, they had a thriving economy and a thriving social system until about 1780. But by 1780, most big nations that made at the time, China and India, 60% of the global economy. At that time, the US was much smaller. They started to decay. The decay was then accelerated also by imperialism and colonialism. But
and again, you've written about the rise and fall of nations. These are historical facts. You spoke about the West being in decline and said we should stop bashing it. It's been a good thing overall until its decline. They're calling that racist. Why is there such an internal hatred in the West of Renaissance and free market? And where do you see the U.S. economy and global economy going?
Well, it's very difficult to tell. But I think that the Western leaders subconsciously realize that they have to control the population somehow. And one way to control it is to make everybody more or less equal. And I just want to mention, because many people don't realize, democracy and social security is an experiment. We don't know how long it will last. For the last 5,000 years, we didn't have democracies. And now, for the last 200 years, we have some sort of democracy. But as you know, in the US, initially only some people could vote and not other groups.
Sure, so it's paradoxical. It creates incredible wealth and freedom, but it also creates spoiled brats.
Yes. Every great civilization went down after they went through a phase of great prosperity. And usually this period of great prosperity, like in Spain after the discoveries of gold in Mexico and in nowadays Bolivia, Potosi, which incidentally became one of the largest cities in the world during the silver boom. But the thing is, these rich countries, then they also go and borrow money. So the debts expand, and eventually they fail, they go bankrupt.
Well, Marc Faber, this is fascinating, and I'd love to get you on for a full hour. We've only got about 2 minutes left. You are a guy that's really predicted major economic developments with incredible accuracy. So just briefly, without folks going to your site, they should go there, gloomboomdoom.com. What is your quick prognosis on the global economy versus the U.S.? Can Trump turn the downward spiral off?
In my view, we had a recovery post June 2009. The bull market began on March 6, 2009. Most of the expansion is driven by credit. The credit as a percent of the global economy has expanded. We have artificially low interest rates. Can you imagine? I went through the 87 crash. That time, in 87, interest rates on the 10 years treasury had gone from 7 to 10%. So the bond market was not in a bubble stage. In year 2000, the 10 years treasury went to 6.5%. In year 2007, when the last crisis occurred, it was at 5.25%. Now we are 2.3%. Portuguese bonds, can you believe they yield 2%? Spanish bonds, 1.7, and so forth. So, I mean, we have a completely distorted money market. And so people, they say, well, I'm not going to put money at zero interest rates, all next to zero interest rates in bonds. I buy stocks, or I buy real estate, or Bitcoins. But it's going to end very badly. We are not in one bubble. We have multiple bubbles.
No, I totally agree. And I like the fact that Trump's at least trying to get taxes cut for the general public and try to control spending. But I think, like Ron Paul says, you'll never be able to completely fix it. How long can the bubble sustain?
With money printing, you can sustain it for a while, but you can't sustain it forever. And the longer it doesn't lead to a crisis recession, the harsher recession.
Absolutely. So we're headed towards some big times here. Absolutely. That's why people need to batten down the hatches. Thank you, Dr. Marc Faber. Gloomboomdoom.com. Hope we'll come back soon. Well, that's the guy just giving you basic history, being called a racist for it.